For 2 decades, China's economy appeared unstoppable. 10% growth year after year, hundreds of millions lifted out of poverty, the world's factory becoming the world's second largest economy. But what if part of that miracle was not just building the reality, but manufacturing the story about that reality? This is the story of how China managed both its economy and the narrative around its economy from 2004 to 2024. Welcome to Manufacturing the Numbers. If you've ever had a boss who sets the target first, then grades the work later, you already understand the core of China's economic model. From the early 2000s onward, Beijing didn't just steer the economy. It steered the instruments that defined how the economy was seen. Think of a control panel with 5 connected instruments, 5-year plans with hard numerical targets. 8% growth, 10 million new urban jobs, specific steel, cement, and rail targets. Window guidance from the People's Bank of China. Informal but powerful directives to major state-owned banks about which sectors to lend to and which to starve. Statistical curation, smoothing reported figures, downplaying volatility, ensuring no surprises in headline GDP. Propaganda coordination, central media guidance on how to frame growth, slowdowns, or crises. Capital controls, tightening or loosening cross-border flows of money whenever market sentiment threatened to get out of hand. None of this was a cartoonish conspiracy. It was a sophisticated coordination mechanism. Targets set at the top filtered down through provincial officials, state-owned enterprises, banks, and statisticians via career incentives and quotas. Hit the number, get promoted. Miss it repeatedly, and your career stalls, or worse. Real growth absolutely happened. You don't build 45,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, dozens of new airports, hundreds of millions of square meters of housing with Photoshop. The question is subtler. When reality became noisy, volatile, uncomfortable, how did the numbers stay so smooth? And what happens when the instruments used to smooth volatility start to collide with each other? In 2007, a U.S. diplomatic cable leaked something extraordinary. Li Keqiang, then party secretary of Liaoning province, later China's premier, told the American ambassador that China's GDP figures were, quote, man-made and therefore unreliable. Instead of trusting headline GDP, Li said he watched 3 indicators: electricity consumption, rail freight volume, bank lending growth. Later, analysts dubbed this the Keqiang Index. Over the next 15 years, that unofficial dashboard often told a very different story than the one in China's official statistics. Take 2004, official GDP, 10.1% electricity consumption, plus under 15% rail freight, strong double-digit gains. Here, the gauges aligned, a genuine industrial boom, factories humming, cities expanding, energy demand surging. Now fast forward to 2015. China was hit by a stock market bubble and crash, capital flight pressures, a surprise mini devaluation of the RMB in August 2015 that shook global markets. On the ground, electricity consumption grew just 0.5%, rail freight actually contracted, down around 10% year-on-year. Heavy industry indicators, steel, cement, were flat or falling, yet official GDP, a smooth 6.9%. Consider the statistical odds that during one of the most turbulent years for China's financial system since 1998, headline growth would glide down by only 1/10 of a percentage point. Another example, 2020, the COVID shock. Q1 2020 official GDP, 6.8%, the first negative print in decades. For full year 2020, plus 2.3%, making China the only major economy to post positive growth that year. But alternative gauges tell a more jagged story. Electricity usage plunged in February, then spiked with stimulus. Rail freight slowed as lockdowns spread, then overshot as factories reopened. Export volumes whipsawed as global demand collapsed, then boomed on PPE and electronics. Yet the GDP line presented a calm, controlled narrative. This doesn't mean nothing in the GDP data is real. It means, whenever the real economy zigged and zagged, the official story often chose a smoother path. At the heart of China's growth model sat a mechanism that looked brilliant and unstoppable, until it didn't: real estate. In 2004, a constitutional amendment declared lawful private property is inviolable. To many observers, this sounded like a historic embrace of Western-style ownership. But one word mattered more than the others: lawful. Land in China largely remained state-owned. Individuals and companies got long-term leases, typically 70 years, not freehold title. This legal structure enabled an enormous circular financing machine. Here's how it worked. Local governments controlled land supply. They sold land use rights to developers at high prices. Developers obtained pre-sale permits, allowing them to sell apartments years before completion. Households bought these pre-sale units, often paying 30 to 50% down, taking out mortgages on apartments that were still dirt and rebar. Banks happily financed this. Mortgages to households, loans to developers, credit to local government financing vehicles, LGFVs, that borrowed against future land sales. Local governments grew addicted to this model. In many cities, land sales accounted for 40 to 70% of fiscal revenues. For roughly 15 years, this circular system turbocharged growth. Property and related sectors reached 25 to 30% of GDP. Household wealth became concentrated, around 70% of urban household assets tied to housing. LGFVs piled up an estimated 45 to 60 trillion yuan in off-balance sheet debt by the early 2020s. All of this worked as long as two things were true. Prices mostly kept rising, and buyers believed unfinished projects would always be completed. In September 2021, the illusion cracked. Evergrande, once China's largest developer, with $300 billion in liabilities, defaulted. Its cash flows depended on constant pre-sales of new projects to fund old ones. When regulators tightened leverage through the three red lines policy, the wheels stopped turning. Construction slowed or halted on hundreds of projects. By 2022-2023, another giant, Country Garden, teetered on the edge, missing bond payments and struggling to finish over 300 developments. Ordinary home buyers suddenly faced a terrifying reality. They were paying mortgages on apartments that might never be delivered. In over 100 cities, buyers organized mortgage boycotts, refusing to pay until construction resumed. This is where the media-managed economy meets raw political risk. You can smooth a GDP line. You cannot easily smooth millions of families angry about paying for ghost apartments. The property machine that once drove growth now threatened to drag it down. To understand how China responded to later crises, we have to go back to 2008-2009. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, the world slid into financial crisis. China, by contrast, unveiled a headline 4 trillion yuan stimulus package, about 13% of GDP at the time. Global media marveled. While the U.S. struggled with bank bailouts and recession, China seemed to power ahead on a wave of infrastructure spending. But the headline 4 trillion yuan was only part of the story. The real stimulus came through credit expansion. Between late 2008 and 2009, new bank lending almost doubled, up 96% year-on-year. A broader measure, total social financing, grew by roughly 31%. M2 money supply soared by about 28%, the fastest pace since the mid-1990s. Electricity consumption, rail freight, industrial production all showed wild swings. Sharp slowdown in late 2008, followed by a surge in 2009 to 2010 as stimulus projects hit the ground. Yet official GDP growth numbers through this turbulence: 9.6% in 2008, 9.2% in 2009, 10.6% in 2010. The line barely wobbled. Behind the scenes, local governments and SOEs rushed to propose new railways, highways, steel mills, concrete plants. Many were productive, many were not. Empty ghost cities and underutilized airports were the visible artifacts. But 2009 established a powerful template used repeatedly in the next decade. When growth slowed or shocks hit, unleash credit aggressively. Channel that credit into infrastructure and property, where local officials could spend quickly. Use statistical smoothing to keep headline GDP within target bands. Wrap the whole episode in a triumphant narrative of China's unique model, outperforming Western chaos. The problem: each round of this playbook required more debt to achieve less growth. Diminishing returns set in as productive projects were exhausted, and marginal spending went into less useful assets. By the mid-2010s, you could see it in the numbers. The incremental capital output ratio, how much investment you need for 1 unit of growth, climbed from around 3.5 to 7.5 or higher. In simple terms, for each yuan of new investment, China was generating more than 80% less GDP than it used to. But the GDP line still looked respectable. Several specific episodes broke through the smooth narrative. Case Study 1. Liaoning, 2017. In early 2017, the northeastern province of Liaoning publicly admitted what many had long suspected. For years, local officials had inflated tax revenues and GDP by 20 to 30%. They did it to meet growth targets set from above. Other provinces quietly conducted statistical revisions, quietly marking down past growth. The message was clear. Even inside the system, there was recognition that some numbers were more aspirational than real. Case Study 2. Evergrande, 2021-2023. Evergrande was founded in 1996, rode the property boom to become one of China's largest developers, and by 2018 was included in the Fortune Global 500. It borrowed aggressively, sold apartments off-plan, and extended into theme parks, electric vehicles, even a professional soccer team. By 2020, Evergrande's total liabilities had swelled to over $300 billion. When regulators imposed 3 red-line rules on developer leverage, Evergrande could no longer roll its debts. In September 2021, it missed bond payments. By 2023, it had defaulted on multiple obligations, its founder had been detained, and thousands of projects were left unfinished. Here, the divergence between narrative and reality was unavoidable. Official statements spoke of orderly risk disposal. Drone footage showed hundreds of ghost concrete skeletons. Homebuyers on social media posted videos from half-built towers vowing not to pay. Case Study 3. Youth Unemployment, 2023. Throughout the 2010s, China emphasized innovation, upgrading the economy, more college degrees. By the early 2020s, that produced millions of new graduates entering a slowing job market. In June 2023, official youth unemployment hit 21.3%. Shortly after, the National Bureau of Statistics announced it would suspend publication of that series to improve methodology. Months went by with no youth jobless data. In December 2023, a new series was released, with changed definitions. Students still in school were now excluded from the labor force calculation. The new youth unemployment rate? A less alarming 14.9%. To many observers, this looked less like methodological improvement and more like definitional management. Case Study 4. Independent Growth Estimates 2023-2024. By 2023-2024, several independent research groups, including Rhodium Group, UCLA, Anderson Forecast, and Capital Economics, began publishing estimates suggesting China's actual GDP growth was closer to 2 to 3%, not the official 5% plus. They triangulated the Keqiang-style indicators, company earnings, trade data, satellite imagery, even nighttime light intensity. No single proxy is perfect, but the convergence of multiple methods consistently pointing well below the official line widened the credibility gap. When that gap narrows, media management is stabilizing. When it widens, media management becomes a liability. By the early 2020s, China faced constraints that no amount of narrative smoothing could erase. Constraint 1. Demographics. China's working-age population peaked around 2013. The fertility rate fell to around 1.09 by 2022-2023, one of the lowest in the world. Annual births dropped from about 18 million in 2016 to roughly 9 million in 2023. That means fewer future workers, fewer consumers, a rising old age dependency burden. You cannot stimulus your way into births that never happened. Constraint 2. Debt. By 2023, China's total debt, government, corporate, and household, had climbed to around 310% of GDP, up from about 170% in 2008. Each round of stimulus added more leverage for less incremental output. The incremental capital output ratio, how many units of investment for 1 unit of GDP, deteriorated from around 3.5 to above 7.5. In plain language, the system became less efficient at turning credit into real growth. Constraint 3. Property wealth. Housing is not just shelter in China, it is the core store of wealth. Estimates suggest 60–70% of household assets are tied up in property. As of 2023-2024, prices in Tier 1 cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, were down roughly 15–20% from peaks. In Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, falls of 20–35% or more were common. Some analysts estimate $5 to $8 trillion in property wealth has been erased, on paper at least. That negative wealth effect chokes consumption. People who feel poorer spend less, even if their incomes haven't collapsed. Constraint 4. Deflation. By 2023-2024, China began flirting with deflation. Consumer Price Index, CPI. Occasionally negative year-on-year. Producer Price Index, PPI. Negative for 18+ consecutive months. Economist Irving Fisher described the debt deflation spiral in the 1930s. As prices fall, the real burden of debt rises. Debtors cut spending to service loans. That reduction in demand pushes prices down further. In an economy as leveraged as China's, deflation is not just an academic concern. It is potentially destabilizing. So what happens next? The detailed book this script advertises lays out 3 broad scenarios. Scenario 1. Hard landing. 20–30% probability. Growth slows sharply to 2–3% or less. Property prices slide further. Developers, LGFVs, and some banks face cascading defaults. Unemployment rises. Youth frustration grows. Capital outflows increase despite controls. Beijing responds with patches and crackdowns, but struggles to maintain previous levels of confidence. Scenario 2. Japan-style stagnation, 50–60% probability. This is the base case. China manages a gradual adjustment. It rolls over bad debts rather than forcing rapid defaults. Keeps growth officially around 4–5%, but real growth is closer to 3–4%. Debt slowly rises toward 350–400% of GDP before stabilizing. Like Japan after 1990, China avoids outright collapse but enters a long period of low growth, mild deflation or disinflation, policy churn, and lost potential. Scenario 3. Successful rebalancing, 15–20% probability. In the optimistic path, China executes difficult reforms, transfers more income to households, through social spending and reduced household tax burdens, boosting consumption, forces real restructuring of zombie SOEs and LGFVs, uses technology to drive genuine productivity gains, not just more capacity. Growth settles at a sustainable 5% plus with lower reliance on property and heavy industry. Is that possible? Yes. Is it easy? No, because every reform threatens entrenched interests that benefited from the old model. The verdict of this story is not, China is a fraud, real factories, real railways, real urbanization happened. The verdict is closer to, for 20 years, China successfully manufactured the numbers to present a smooth, confident narrative, while underlying reality was more volatile, more leveraged, and more dependent on pulling future demand forward. The future arrived between 2021 and 2024, when Evergrande defaulted, when youth unemployment became too visible to hide, when independent estimates consistently found much lower growth, when property wealth started to deflate. For 2 decades, when you both set the targets and grade yourself, you can look good on paper. But arithmetic eventually insists on honesty. By 2024, that insistence became undeniable. The media-managed economy's instruments still operate. Stimulus headlines are announced, GDP often lands near target, but markets, analysts, and an increasing share of domestic households no longer take the numbers at face value. Because observable reality, deflation, unemployment, property slowdown, capital controls tightening, contradicts the old story. The question is no longer whether China will face a reckoning. The question is, what form will that reckoning take? And is the rest of the world ready for the moment when the world's second largest economy can no longer manufacture its narrative quite as easily as before, and must confront its own arithmetic? Manufacturing the Numbers, Reverse Engineering China's Media-Managed Economy, 2004-2024. Available now.